I had maybe 100 or 150 failed attempts behind me, of me saying, that's it, no more. I'm not doing it today. I honestly can't say what the difference was that one time, but that one time I was well and truly freaking done. And I just said to my wife, I have to get help. It's out of control. I can't control it. And it was terrifying.
Hey, everybody, welcome to the Addiction Unlimited podcast, where you get to learn everything you want to know about addiction and recovery. I'm your host, Angela Pugh, co-founder of Kansas City Recovery, life coach, and recovering alcoholic. To learn more about me, you can listen to episode 0 on your podcast app or find us on the web at addictionunlimited.com. Hi, Will. Thank you so much for coming on and doing this show with me. It's so good to see you.
Hey, Angela. Good to see you too.
Take a couple of minutes and tell everybody a little bit about you and what you do.
Thank you. So my name is Will Thatcher, and I'm an author of addiction fiction novels. I'm also an addiction fiction nerd and fan, and that's my little world. I'm a sober guy, and I love these stories. I'm a big, lifelong avid reader. And, I just sort of found this space, which there's really not that much in it. There are a handful of authors that have done some great work, and I'm passionate about it. And, so that's how I'm spending my time these days.
You know, what I love about this is it's not the typical books that you get in the recovery space, right? It's not self-help based. It's not personal story based. It's not a memoir or a how-to or a guide, right? This is really reading for enjoyment.
Totally. Yeah, that's exactly right. And, there are so many good books that are in the categories that you just listed. And there are new ones out every year, and it's very well represented. Personally, I love fiction. It's something that I grew up with. I always had a book in my hands. And from my perspective, it's 90% enjoyment. And there is a 10%, value in terms of, relating this to my recovery, reading about people who are going through the same types of things, albeit in much more extreme circumstances in my books, relating that back to my own recovery. When we watch a movie, for example, that has characters in recovery or in active addiction, I have a very direct emotional reaction to that because I've lived through that pain. And I can, I won't quite call it a spiritual experience, but certainly I'll have an emotional experience, a connection, to those characters. So I do think that there is some little residual benefit, to my recovery when I read these books.
Yeah, I would agree with that for sure. And I think the audience can relate to this also in that, recovery can be heavy work, right? Like it takes, especially in the beginning, it takes so much of you and your time and your energy, and it can start to feel very overwhelming. So, to not constantly be immersed in the self help, the personal development, sobriety, recovery, change your life, get your act together, to have something that has some pieces of that and the familiarity of recovery and recovery language, but to have it be just for enjoyment, I think is so powerful. And I'm really excited to watch this category grow.
It's nice to hear you say that, and I personally agree with that entirely. This is deadly serious stuff.
Yeah.
Literally. But also, I'm a big AA guy. And we always say there has to be some fun in it.
Yes.
Or else people aren't going to want it. And so, I think that this is a way to, keep a foot in the work, keep the themes and the ideas, that you're trying to bring into your mind, you're trying to bring into your life, and take a little bit of a break from the from the hardcore recovery aspect of it. I do think I think it's worth mentioning that a lot of what I write is definitely not so much for people like in their first 3 or 6 months of recovery. There are much better things that those people should be reading, than fiction. Frankly, their lives are at stake. My work is really much more for people who have a little bit of sobriety under their belts. They're living a sober life and they want to relate to and hear stories about, sober characters that are out there. All of my stories, I'm getting ready to publish my second novel now. And what I write about is what's interesting to me, right? What's kind of going on in my life and in my head, which are kind of like next step sober problems. Okay, like you got sober, your life got good, then what? Because that's kind of what I'm interested in at this point, and that's what a lot of my characters go through.
Yeah, I appreciate you saying that. And it reminds me of when I was new. I'm a 12-step person also. And I remember when I was really new sitting in those rooms and for several months, right? Like not understanding a lot of the lingo and like the one-liners. And now I love those things, right? Because I've been in it for 100 years and it all makes sense to me. And it's this beautiful sort of shorthand, like you can pop out this one-liner and it has so much profound meaning once you get it. It simplifies things. But when I was new sitting in there, I was like, what the hell are these people talking about? I just didn't understand those things. So I appreciate you pointing that out, that there is some depth of knowledge, but I think it can also bring some really great familiarity to the recovery world and some of that terminology and what it means. So I think it could go both ways, but you definitely want to have some basic understanding of a sober life.
Yeah, I mean that's why, everybody recommends what they recommend to the newcomer, right?
Right.
90 and 90. There's an immersion, that should happen in the beginning so that, to your point, you start to speak the language,
Yeah.
and you start to think in those terms, and then from that point on, yes, you don't have to necessarily um, go to a meeting or two or three a day like I did, for my first 3 to 6 months in sobriety.
Yeah, for sure. So let's talk a little bit about your personal journey. Like, what was it for you? At what point did you recognize that you really had a problem?
I mean, I knew I had a problem for a good year or two before the rest of the world was rudely introduced to it. My problem came to light during a family vacation. And I've actually heard a couple of other people tell versions of this story in the rooms, which was gratifying to me. I had spent the last really year and a half of my using and drinking in isolation, and I had gotten very good at hiding away from my family and from friends and, doing my thing, doing at that time what I thought of as whatever I had to do to get through the day, right? Surviving in this head of mine. And then we booked a vacation. I went away with not just my direct family, but my extended family for 2 weeks. And there was no hiding. There was no, sitting in my office, behind two closed doors, and it was unmanageable. And so I ran around for the first half of it, trying to keep a buzz going, trying to figure out a way to do this. And it just became clear that, not just to me, but to everybody else, that this was a real problem and it needed to be addressed. And it was really humiliating to have that happen in such a public way, but probably the best thing that could have happened.
What did you do, like, when you really understood, okay, this has to stop, right? We get to that, what I call, what everybody refers to as that sort of rock bottom moment. And just to clarify, because there is a misconception about rock bottom doesn't have to be a huge, extravagant event. Rock bottom is just the very moment you hit in your head that you're like, oh my gosh, I cannot live like this anymore. Something has to change. So you have that epiphany. What was your next thought and next action to get started in making the change?
Well, I had maybe 100 or 150 failed attempts behind me, of me saying, that's it, no more. I'm not doing it today. I honestly can't say what the difference was that one time, but that one time I was well and truly freaking done. And I just said to my wife, I have to get help. It's out of control. I can't control it. It's totally out of my hands. Whatever happens, happens. And it was terrifying. So, we came home, from the vacation, and my plan was to get myself into a rehab, go spend 28 days somewhere and let them tell me what to do, like, but in the meantime, I decided to hit a couple of AA meetings, while I got that all sorted out. I have a good, close cousin who's in recovery, who's a huge AA proponent. I actually have two cousins, both of whom I adore, and whose lives are incredible, because of recovery. And they always talk about AA. I guess they talked about it in front of me for a reason. But,
We call that
um,
planting seeds.
I think that's right. So I went to AA. I sat down in a meeting, and, I heard my first couple of sober stories, and I was hooked. That's what really, I tell people, that's what got me sober, was the stories, that I heard in AA. Before there was fellowship, before there were steps, before there was service, any of the other, key kind of aspects of recovery, before I even knew what those things were. I heard those stories. I read myself into every one of them, even if the circumstances were totally different from mine. I love the arc of the qualification, what happened, how it is now, just amazing people being incredibly honest. And I really kind of thought, okay, if they can do this, I can do this. They sound just like me. They're literally saying the things that are inside my head, so I must be in the right place. I'm not a stupid person, that I can connect those two things, right? I think I can do this. So I kind of like held off on the rehab thing because I thought I could, the great and powerful me, could sort this out on my own. But, I did like AA immersion,
Mhm,
like
mhm.
2 or 3 meetings a day. My work was in the garbage at that point, turned out to be a blessing in some ways. And so I was doing 2 or 3 meetings every day and following guys around, and, that was how I got sober.
Hearing you say all of that just again takes me back to my early days, and it's so much the same experience. And I know a ton of people listening right now are nodding their heads in agreement, right? Where you sit and you hear the other people share. And this isn't a 12-step specific thing. We have the same people say the same thing in my online community. And I'm sure they have the same experience in other people's online communities. But you hear people share their stories and you hear your story just with their details, and it's a really powerful experience when you can sit back and go, "Oh, wow, I'm not the only one." Because I think in active addiction, it's so isolating. Even if you're not isolated physically, right? Even if you're going out and drinking with people and you're not isolating in that way, mentally and emotionally, psychologically, it's so isolating because you feel so different from everyone else. I know for sure I felt like I was the biggest piece of garbage on the planet. I was disgusting. I thought my drinking was worse than everybody's, right? Because in my immediate friend group, I was probably the worst. And then I got to the rooms and I hear other people talking and sharing those stories. And I was like, oh, wow. Okay. I'm not so isolated. I'm not on this one man island all by myself. I do have people that I can connect with and that truly understand.
Yeah, totally. And there's a whole room full of them here, nodding along the way that I am. And, for me personally, that's how I learn the best is, through stories, which is why I do what I do.
Right.
It's a passion of mine. But the thing that you pointed to, just now, that was really powerful for me also was just the self-talk that was going on in my
Mm.
head at that point was so vicious.
Mhm.
Um, it was so negative.
Mhm.
Um, and, I was just brutalizing myself. By the time, I got in there, like you said, I was the worst person,
Yeah.
you know, let's be honest. I did some pretty bad things,
Yeah. Yeah.
and so there was some evidence available for that
Right.
for that theory,
Right.
but that's not the whole story.
That's
I was
right.
also a sick person, and
Yeah.
I'd also done some really good things, and so being among people who have felt that way, in the past, and getting their compassion back in such a direct way was life-saving for me.
Yeah, that's so important what you just said too, that it wasn't the whole story. I always say like we are all a 1,000-piece puzzle. And I definitely have some bad pieces, right? I have some trauma pieces and I have pieces of my personality that can be really unpleasant. I have bad pieces, but that's not all my pieces, right? We all have good ones and bad ones. And luckily, because of recovery, my bad pieces have gotten a little bit smaller and my good pieces have gotten a little bit bigger. But it's important to remember that it's not the whole story. And just like as a sober person, I'm sure you'll agree with this too, being sober a long time, like my sobriety isn't my whole story either, right? There's still all these other pieces and facets of my personality that are super important that I have to be mindful of. And I have to nurture all those pieces too.
Totally. Yeah. And, you know, maybe the most valuable thing that I learned in early sobriety was to discount my thoughts by about 90%,
For
whatever they
sure.
were,
Yes.
whether they were good or bad. You know, I have on a long list of things that I have no control over. My thoughts is at the top of that list,
Yeah.
and, this brain just cranks out bad data, on a regular basis. And so, the most useful thing that I can do is to understand that,
Yeah.
and when I get an idea or a thought or, whatever it is, say, okay, that's just a thought. That's not a fact. That is not how the world is. That is not how this person is. That is not how I am. It's just the latest thing that comes out of this head of mine. And I learned to try to lead as much as possible with my heart and not with my head, because my heart is much more reliable. My love, my compassion, if I lead with that, I really can't go too wrong. I can't really
Right.
mess things up too badly. I'd been in the process of messing things up for a long time, so I was in the stop messing things up business at
Right.
that point. um, and so that was a very good strategy for me for a long time. It remains a good strategy.
Yeah, remembering too that those thoughts don't go away just because you put down the drink, right? Those thoughts in my head, that self talk and how vicious it was, didn't magically disappear when I stopped chugging tequila on a daily basis, right? That's the stuff, that's really the recovery part that you have to work on and shift that. And just having that understanding is so powerful too, that I couldn't trust what my head was telling me early in the game. I needed outside counsel. I needed another human that was farther along in the process that I could talk those things through with and go, well, this is what my head's telling me. This is what I think I should do, to have that person go, oh no, that's not what you want to do at all.
Exactly. Yeah, no, I totally relate to that. For me, the tone of the voice changed
Mm,
over time. It was less vicious.
yeah.
It was equally unreliable, but it was not as negative, over time. And that's actually one of the themes in Killing Hurt, is that the main character, because he's been sober for a little while, and he feels better and his life conditions have improved, and, he's living a sober life, he becomes much more confident in this voice in his head, and he doesn't
Mm.
realize that he's still full of bad ideas.
Yeah, right, right,
So he has all of these sort of judgments and, all of his thinking, and he's so sure of them because he's a smart guy, and he establishes in the beginning of the book how smart he is, and how vital that is to his character, but he's wrong all the time. So it's like amazing how often this guy's wrong, and that's me. That's how I
right.
walk through the life. So that's kind of what I like to do, with the book, is whatever I'm journaling on, whatever I'm 10th stepping, in my recovery, it ends up being sort of embedded in one of these characters somehow.
Okay, so you just mentioned 10th stepping. So I want you to explain to everybody what that is, because a vast piece of my audience is not going to understand what that means.
Oh, sure. Yeah. So the 10th step is, so steps 10, 11, and 12 are in AA, the maintenance steps, meaning these are the steps that you're supposed to do, for the rest of your life once you finish your step work. And so the 10th step is essentially your inventory. So each night, the way that I do inventory is that I sit down with a notebook every night and I just write, what's going on in my head, and then I look at what's there, and I try to identify where are my character defects at play in this story that's playing out in Will Thatcher's head, right? And I point them out. I'm like, okay, there's some greed, there's some dishonesty, there's some fear, a lot of fear in my inventory. And I personally, my next step is I pray to have those removed. And the next day when I'm talking to my sponsor, which I do on a daily basis, I say, okay, a lot of fear, got this crazy thought, said this crazy thing, because I have it written down, from the day before. So that's how I sort of process my thoughts on a daily basis.
Yeah, and I so appreciate you in just in the vulnerability of pointing out some of those character defects, right? Because another term that a lot of people won't understand, but the character defects are, like you said, greed, ego, selfishness, fear, all of those things that we really get caught up in. And that daily inventory of the 10th step is not unlike what you're doing in your head anyway, right? If you've never been to a 12-step meeting, when you get home after your day and you're unwinding and you're getting ready to go to bed, you're thinking through your day and what happened. And did you have some uncomfortable conversations? Did you not handle yourself well? Did you dodge a phone call that you probably should have taken because you were in fear of having the conversation or uncomfortable with it, or it was a bill collector and you've got financial fear, right? You're doing this on a daily basis anyway, as a regular non 12 step person. In the 12 steps, we just make it a point to be more intentional about it and really think through, because you have to be able to pick out those patterns about yourself. And one of my favorite things about 12 steps from day one was exactly like everything you just said, and your raw honesty about who and what you are. And that was so attractive to me from day one, because I had never been honest about much, right? But certainly not about myself and my flaws, right? And then all of a sudden I'm sitting in this room listening to people just really own who they were. And it was so powerful to me. And I knew immediately, like, I wanted that quality. I wanted to be able to be vulnerable like that and just say, this is who the F I am. And all my pieces aren't great, but I also have some really great ones, you know?
Yeah, and the last part of what you said I think is super important, which is that I also write down the things that I did well.
Yeah.
So that it doesn't look like the old Will, who's just beating himself up every night on
Sure.
paper. But you're right. It to me it's about the trends.
Yes.
And so when I see fear, or self-centeredness, every night for like 4 or 5 days in a row, I'm like, okay, well, maybe there's something going on there, and I should probably, get to the bottom of that. And, look, you don't have to do this. It's a question of how happy do you want to be?
Right.
Do you want to, walk around, mid-level? That's fine. For a lot of people, mid-level is a huge win,
Yeah, right. Right.
um,
Well, like
you
mid-level
know,
can be a lot of progress from where we're starting.
Totally, totally. But, for me personally, it's like I always sort of have the attitude of I'm either moving closer to a drink or a drug, or I'm moving away from it, So I don't do well with just standing still. There
Mm.
is really no standing still for me. It's a
Mhm.
fluid dynamic. And, so yes, there's fear associated with that, but that's also the truth. That's also based on my experience. So just doing that every night, it might sound more elaborate than it actually is. I think
Yeah,
it might
right.
take me 5 minutes,
Right. I'm so
on a
glad you
lot of
pointed
nights.
that out, because people are like, "Oh my gosh, how do you have time to do
Yeah.
this every day?" It's like,
Mm,
"No, dude, it's a few minutes."
Yeah, really not a big task. I mean, it's like scribble, scribble, scribble. Sometimes if I get like carried away with an idea, I'll write it out, but that's because I'm a
Sure.
writer.
Right.
That's not part of necessarily the inventory process.
So I definitely want to get into the book because I am in love with this book. You mentioned it, Killing Hurt. And I love when you were talking about it, really talking about the character. And this is something, as a layperson, I think about this all the time, like with television and movies, as well as books, where there is this whole character development piece that, as the observer, you don't always have that story, right? You don't get all the pieces that really go into developing these characters. So, as you were talking about him and he's smart and how important that is to him, right? It's so cool to hear about that character development. Where did this character come from for you?
Well, the main character is really an amalgamation, of a few different people. Um, you know, plus, a handful of ideas and themes that come from, like we just talked about, my my inventory. So, his circumstances come from a buddy of mine in college, who's actually still, more or less my best friend. Hopefully he'll listen to this, and that'll he'll be glad to know that I still think of him that way. And that was, the his sort of life story was, was in college. His parents couldn't afford it, moved to Florida to become a corrections officer, because that was the best job he could get without a degree at 19. Became a police officer, and some of the, the high level details around, the marriage and, those situations. I sort of borrowed his life a little bit. He thinks I borrowed his life more than I actually did. He likes to read basically every positive attribute that this character has as himself, but I'm not gonna argue with him about that. And the rest of it is really like combinations of, a little bit of me, a little bit of this person. The guy is a sober surfer, which I am those two things. So people are like, "Oh, you wrote a book about yourself." Not at all. I mean, this guy's very different from me in a lot of ways, which honestly made it a lot more interesting for me, to write this, because it's really not autobiographical.
Hmm.
So yeah, and I think you could say the same thing for the other characters. There are pieces of like my sober crew, my fellowship group. There are aspects of each one of their stories, there are aspects of each one of their personalities, aspects of their professional or family lives that I've borrowed and sort of, put this Frankenstein, put these Frankenstein characters together based on all of them. So it is a little bit annoying, honestly, because they read the book and try to, read themselves into,
Right, right.
because there's like one thing that they recognize. So, oh, that's me.
Hmm.
Uh, it's not, so I have a little bit of that, but yeah, I mean, that's more or less how the characters get developed. And I spent months writing out character sketches, before I ever, started on the story. Because to me, that's everything that's the thing that I'm most interested in, honestly, is the people, and their stories. Um, and then once I felt like I really knew these people, then like the book can kind of just write itself, from there. I had,
Mm.
kind of high level idea of the plot, but the interactions and everything else and all the, the things that happen there are just because I feel like I knew them really well.
Hmm. What inspired you to pursue writing a book in this genre?
Well, I guess I've always sort of thought of myself as a writer, despite the fact that there isn't a long line of books behind me.
Now, I guess that's
I
an important distinction to make too, right? Like, you're not a career author. I mean, you're getting there now, but that's not what you've been doing your whole adult life, correct?
That's right. Yeah,
Yeah.
that's right. I've had a career, for the last 25 years, in another field. I did write a couple of novels early in life, like one in college and one in my early 20s, that are dreadful. I've looked back at them recently, and it's like reading your journal from, when you were 21.
Right.
It's like a little cringy.
The beauty is you get to see how far you've come.
I'll take that. Thank you. Yeah, so definitely some progress since then, not just in terms of uh, the themes, but the writing. And so what happened was I was actually out after a meeting at the diner with my guys, and my sponsor. mentioned to us that he had signed up and he had started a series of acting classes. And he was talking about the acting classes, and I was thinking, gosh, that sounds amazing. Like at this stage of life, I mean, at that point, I'm like 48 years old, and I'm like, at this stage of life, to have that kind of creative outlet, it just sounded like such a luxury to me. I was like,
Mm.
I'm really impressed that he took the time to do this. I'm like, I wish I could do something. I'm like, wait a minute, I have a thing that I do, why don't I just do that? Sometimes the best ideas are the most obvious, and
Mhm.
simple ones. And so I just sat down and started doing it. And yeah, so that's how it started.
How long did it take you to write the book? I mean, you just said you had months of character development. So really like from start to finish, having a book in your hand, like how long?
Well, the first draft of it was probably about 5 months in total. And then the editing process was, probably another five, way, way longer than I imagined. I was very lucky to find a couple of editors that understood what I was going for, and really helped me sort of deconstruct it and put it back together again. Um, a lot of the sort of flashback scenes that I have, going to the character's early life were more, they're almost like essays initially, and they were incredibly detailed. And so the consensus was this is great source material. This does not belong in a novel. And I kind of knew that. Like I said before, I read constantly. And I knew it was different from, but I had a hard time accepting that I needed to pare that stuff down by like 80%. And so the
Mm.
process of getting rid of these things that I had become really attached to, honestly, the aspects of characters, the stories that I thought were just so cool and so interesting. And my editors were like, yeah, cool, interesting, not necessary, and so I have like all this other material that had to get carved out, you know, and Troy's father, Joe, for example. Like I went down a rabbit hole with that character like you wouldn't believe, and I just was like infatuated with this guy, and I wrote and wrote and wrote and wrote and wrote. And I thought it was amazing. Like he was so interesting. And they were like, yeah, it's super interesting. Like that, yes, that is an inherently interesting human being, but we're trying to tell a story here about this guy, so we probably don't want to go, quite that far. You know what I'm saying? So
Yeah, yeah,
there was a big part of that was a big part of the process.
yeah. What were some of your fears in writing the book?
Um, I took a very low stakes approach to this, Angela. It was really like a personal um, project. Um, Toward the end, of course, there's a fear that, oh god, other people are going to read this actually, and so I think at that point, the normal, I think, concerns about judgment and one of the big fears was that the main character's parents are featured very prominently in the book, and I was concerned that my parents would be offended, that some of the character traits and attributes of of those people made it into the book. So that was a concern. But yeah, I think those are the main ones.
Yeah. Okay, so tell everybody again the genre, the name of the book, and where they can get it.
Okay. The genre is addiction fiction. Um, and whether you read my book or not, if you're in addiction, I definitely recommend you get out there and get into addiction fiction. And my book reviews will point you to some other authors who are really talented in this space and can get you into it. The name of my book is Killing Hurt. And you can buy it pretty much wherever you buy books online, Amazon, Barnes and Noble, all those places.
Perfect. I love that. This is such a good book. It was such a fun read, and I'm so looking forward to your next one. Honestly, it was really great. And I'm going to explore some of these other addiction fiction books too, because it's just nice and relaxing and enjoyable. And I need more of that kind of reading in my life too. So, one last question. What is your idea of a perfect evening? Like when you're winding down a busy week, right? I don't know your family situation, but work, kids, partners, whatever. When you get home on a Friday evening and it's unwind time, what does that look like?
It's so uninteresting that I almost don't even want to say it.
I'm the
You know what I
same way.
mean?
I get it.
I mean, I almost feel like I need to lie here, to spice this up, but I'm not going to, because that'll end up in my inventory later. What my idea is, so my wife's perfect idea would be for us to go out to dinner and, either just us or with friends. Um, I would probably prefer to stay home, order in. I would love to be able to spend some time talking to my kids, but they're super busy. So, I would try to steal, a few minutes with each of them to, get some kind of connections, something that, that I can look at and at the end of the day and be grateful for. And then honestly, just hang out with my wife, and talk about what happened that week and hear about her week and try to reconnect there because that's kind of my she's kind of my plug into the world, so I need to like maintain that connection first and foremost, and do my meditation at the end of the night. It's always enjoyable and important for me, and do my inventory. And I would like to, in the ideal circumstances, be asleep by 10:30 so that so that I could get up by 5 and do my morning routine.
It sounds like you are employing all of the most important factors of recovery and long term recovery, right? It's connection, reflection, it's refueling, relaxation, self care. Like you're doing all of the most important things. And I mean, that looks different for everybody, right? But what a beautiful evening you just described.
I'm glad you think so.
And then the next night, take your wife out to dinner.
Yeah. Okay.
Will, thank you so much again for coming on and having this conversation with me. For everybody listening, I will link to the book in the show notes. It's called Killing Hurt. You can pick it up at all the major retailers, anywhere you buy books. And I definitely encourage you to check it out. It is an awesome read. Thanks again, Will.
Thanks a lot. I appreciate it.
You've reached the end of another great episode of the Addiction Unlimited podcast. Candid and honest conversation about addiction and recovery. Be sure to visit us at addictionunlimited.com to join the conversation and access show notes and links to everything we talked about. Love this episode? Please take 30 seconds to subscribe, rate, and review on iTunes to help us improve and give you the information you want. Thanks for listening. See you next week.